Okay, so appreciate that, your patience. So first of all, for those who are unaware, I'm Odwirafo Kwesi Radnehambata Akan Odwirafo of Akwamu Mine, Amaruka Tifimudi Akwamu Nation in North America within Odwiraman, the purified nation, Afurakaini people, African Black people in the Western Hemisphere. So what we wanted to do today is just go over briefly the Hoodoo origins of Black History Month, Afurakaini, African American Heritage Month, whatever terminology we want to use. So what we want to do is talk about this in the Akan ritual calendar. Now, there are a couple of calendars, and there's some information that we've gone over in our different publications. Okay, so this is one of the charts that we're utilizing. So you see the spring, summer, fall, and winter. So March 21st, spring, of course, vernal equinox, June 20th, 21st, summer solstice, September 22nd, 23rd, autumn equinox, and then you have, December 20th, 21st, the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, 15 hours of darkness, 9 hours of sunlight. Now, of course, these are the seasons. It's been a sacred cycle. There are different energy complexes that govern these different parts of the year for our sacred calendars going back thousands of years. So when we move into this, have these sacred observances. They're part of our ancestral religious practice. We also have the midpoints between these. So when we have our sacred Cosmogram here, which we call the Per Ankh Nut, various Afurakaini people, African Black people, have this similar Cosmogram. People are very often made familiar with this because of the Bakongo people, the Dikenga, Dia Congo, sacred Cosmogram, which is similar to this one. But various Afurakaini groups have that sacred symbolism. One of them is our ancestral clans, which is the Akan people of Ghana and Ivory Coast, West Africa, and so forth. Afuraikai, we have the Okrakomuadie. This is a sacred symbol that encompasses this sacred cosmogram. So it's just proof that the Akan people have been utilizing this symbol for thousands of years. The different color-coded circles represent the different phases of the cycle of the sun, the Oriya. So on the yellow phase, where it's sunrise, that's also akin to the Mframa, the air element. That's around March 20th, 21st, vernal equinox. That's also akin to sunrise during the day. Then you have the highest point in the sky, the hottest time of the day, which is noon, the hottest time of the year, which is the summer solstice. That's the Oja in Akan, which the term is fire. Oja, it's like Mframa is air. Oja is fire. That's that position, June 22nd and so forth, 21st. Then you have the sun setting in the evening point around 6 p.m. and so forth. But that's also akin in the yearly cycle to the equinox, evening point, September 22nd, 23rd. That's the first day of fall, autumn equinox, and so forth. That's the Nsio, or the water element. And then when the sun sets in the west, goes through the water and so forth, and goes under, and goes into the underworld, the Asase, the earth element, as you can see here, the black circle, the hidden black Oriya, the hidden sun, and so forth. That is December 21st, 20th, 21st, the winter solstice. But it's also akin to that's the darkest time of the year, but it's also the darkest time of the 24-hour cycle, midnight, and so forth. So you have these sacred cycles. There's a shift in energy that takes place even just during the regular day cycle. When the sun rises and you rise with the sun to the hottest time of the day when you should engage in your most vigorous activity, the sun begins to set, your body begins to cool down just like the earth cools down. And the same thing when you go into the quote unquote underworld, when you go to sleep, to regenerate, recalibrate, and all these, different things. The same thing with the cycles of the earth throughout the course of the year. And we live in harmony with these sacred cycles. Animals fly south for the winter, bears hibernate, crocodiles go into estivation and so forth at different times of the year based on the cycles of earth and the energy complex of the sun, the Oriya, as it interfaces with Asase, the fertile earth mother, as well as Asase Afua, and Asasiya, the barren earth mother. So just like we would recognize these sacred cycles, we recognize them in ancient Khanid and Kemet and so forth, we continued these practices and engaged in ritual practices at these sacred points of the year. Just like we engage in mundane ritual at these sacred points during the day and during the year, just like animals engage in certain activities during these certain points during the day and year and so forth, we have a natural inclination to engage certain practices at these times. There's a vortex of energy that opens up, so to speak, a portal, so to speak, or an incision that takes place where you can move into the spirit realm in a more, easily, moving in a fashion that's very easy. Ritual practice through ritual song, ritual dance, ritual chant, ritual prayer, ritual movement, and so forth at these sacred points. Now, just like you have these sacred points during the course, of the day, during the course of the year, there are also the midpoints. So the midpoints are 40 days, 42 days after the main point. So, and you'll see in so-called Wiccan and New Age spirituality, they have different, names in Irish and different languages for the midpoints, as well as the solstices and equinoxes, like Beltane and all of this. But they learned about that from our ancestral culture. Now, and so this is one of the documents we use in our Hoodoo course, one of our Hoodoo courses, dealing with elemental asceticism. And you'll see that we have the midpoints laid out. So if you have the winter solstice, for example, December 20th, 21st, 40 days after that is that midpoint, which is February 2nd. Then you have 40 plus days after that. So you have a total of 91 days for a cycle. So it's 84 days plus a 1 week sacred observance, or 84 days plus a 1 week sacred observance, which equals 91. And every season is 91 days, and that equals 364 days plus the 365th day is the New Year's Day and so forth. So, but 40 days after each sacred point is a midpoint. So December 21st, 22nd, or December 20th, 21st, winter solstice, 40 days after that, February 2nd. That is a sacred midpoint. You'll see in the mundane calendar, there's some observance in each one of these midpoints, and most people are unaware of where these observances came from. February 2nd, you see Groundhog's Day. But that's actually originally a sacred ancient midpoint. In Akan culture, for example, when someone transitions, they, go into the spirit realm, they die, go into the spirit realm and so forth. There's a sacred time period between 40 and 42 days that the spirit continues to interact with the family. And then after that 40-day period, then they make their full transition to the spirit realm and so forth. And there's a sacred observance held for the person after that 40th day. And it's a 40 to 42 day cycle that coincides with the 42-day month of the sacred Akan calendar. Every 42 days is a sacred ancestral observance, which we call Awusiedai, as well as Awukwadai. Let me show you that real quick so you can. Okay, this is on our website, Awusiadai or Akwesiadai and Awukudai page. So we say our Kanfo utilize a calendar system which is comprised of 9 cycles of 42 days. The 42-day cycles are called Ada Dria 9. And we talk about that a little bit, but just so you can see, every 6th Awusida, where every 6th Sunday is an Awusiadai or Akwesiadai, a sacred ancestral Sunday. So just to give you an example, the last one was January 19th. The next one is March 2nd. Hold on a second. Next one is April 15th, May 25th. So you'll see every 6th Sunday, every 42 days, we have this sacred ancestral observance. And in between that, we have what they call the little Adai or the Adai Kakra, which is Awuku Adai. Every 6th Wednesday or Awukuda, there's a little ancestral observance, Awuku Adai. But the major one is every 6th Sunday or every 6th Akwesida, Awusida is an Akwesi Adai or Awusi Adai, a sacred cycle. That 42-day cycle where there's a sacred abosom divinity that governs each one of those 42 days. And we go through these 42-day cycles. 2 of those cycles together is 84 days. And then a 1-week observance that equals 91 days. And that's our, seasonal cycle. So why do we have these 42 days associated with 42 divinities? And it's a sacred cycle of completion. And this is what all Akan people across the continent, even if they're not fully invested in their ancestral culture, some of them have been brainwashed with Christianity and Islam and so forth, but they still maintain this sacred cycle. So for example, Akan people, millions of Akan people all over the continent on coming up, let me scroll back up real quick. Coming up on March 2nd, they're going to be observing Akwesiadai, Awusiadai next Sunday. Whether they're on the continent or those of us who are Akan in North America, this is an ancestral observance. So everybody's on the same page now. So I don't know what's going on with StreamYard. Maybe it's just moving kind of slow. So this is the front cover of the book. This is one of the 31 books we've published. But this is a section from the text, one of the papyri, specifically the Papyrus of Ani. And it's showing, this is a section of the text showing some of these 42 divinities. So when someone transitions, whenever you transition, you go before each one of these 42 divinities to know that you haven't violated the aspect of creation that they govern. When you go before each one of these 42 divinities and you pass that test and so forth, then you're allowed to go before Al-Sar, who's the 43rd divinity, who's the judge of the deceased and so forth, and you're able to be accepted into the region of the ancestral realm where your spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors are. In ancient Kemet, there were 42 sepatu, or so-called nomes or administrative divisions, kind of like 42 states. Just like there are 50 states in America, plus the District of Columbia, which is the capital. In ancient Kemet, there were 42 sepatu, or administrative divisions, so-called states, plus the capital, which is quote-unquote 43, the 43rd. You had 42 divinities, abosom, that regulate creation and so forth. They govern the 42 sepatu, or nomes that govern the entire country, plus the sovereign is the 43rd divinity. In the country, the capital of Kemet is a 43rd division and so forth. And so you have this sacred cycle. Physiologically, you have 43 pairs of nerves. And those 43 pairs of nerves distribute, communication and course, inclusive of sacred energy to every part of the body. So your 43 pairs of nerves, without those nerves working and so forth, nothing in the body connects. So these 42 divinities plus the judge, which is Asar, making 43, they regulate the communication, the energetic web throughout creation. Also in miniature as a microcosm within your body. Physiologically, the seat or the shrine of these 43 divinities, 42 plus 1, are the 43 pairs of nerves that regulate your entire body. And your energetic body is regulated by these 42 plus 1 divinities. That's why in our Akan culture, we have 42 days and so forth. And since we don't start with 0, we start, start with 1. And then we count 1, go 1 through 42. And then the next point, we start back at 1. They'll call it an inclusive counting system. And therefore, it's 43 days because 1 and the final day is the same day and so forth. Just like our week is from Sunday, not Sunday to Saturday, but Sunday to Sunday. Awusida, Joda, Benada, Awukuda, Afiada, Memenada, which is Saturday, and then back to Awusida. It's the first day, but also the last day. It's the first day and also the last day because it's similar to Bebra, or reincarnation. When someone is born, they come into the world, they live in the world, they transition, but then they return to the world through the same clan that they were born of before. So the person that's being born is a new, quote unquote, child, but it's also an ancient ancestor or ancestress who's returning. So it's a similar thing when we deal with counting. We don't, in the context of the calendar system, we don't start with 0. We start with 1, and then the return, the final day, is also the first day. It's like the reincarnation of a week. So when you look at the sacred Akan calendar, it's a 42-day calendar, Ada, Dria 9, but it's a 43-day inclusive week. So, or cycle. 42 divinities, 42 days, plus the ending day is also the beginning, so that's the 43rd day. It's also the first day and so forth. 42 divinities plus the judge makes 43. 42 sacred divisions or states of the country plus the capital makes 43. But of course, the capital is within the country, so it's reborn within the country and so forth. So the final, division, 43rd, is really the first division because it's the capital. As you can see, it's similar to Bebra reincarnation. So in our Akan culture, we have these 42 days connected to 42 abosom. We've governed ourselves accordingly for thousands of years, going all the way back to ancient Khanid and Kemet into North America. So we have the sacred observance, for example, of the autumn equinox, the fall equinox and so forth. 40 days after that, you have a midpoint. So let's get back to the midpoints. Every time you have a sacred, quaternary point, you have a midpoint 40 days after. So let's look at that. All right, so now that you see that we have the sacred cardinal points, so to speak, associated with the Mframa, air, Oja, fire, Nsuo, water, Asase, earth, the sacred cycles of the sun. And so we have these days. In this particular chart, when we're teaching in our Hoodoo course, we were talking about elemental asceticism and purificatory practices associated with these different sacred days. So you'll see, for example, we have March 20th, spring equinox at sunrise, also sprouting and the unfolding of plant life and so forth, ritual movement. May 1st, May Day, mid-spring, maturing, meditation. June 1st, summer solstice, noon, full flowering, exercise. So we have abstinence, diet, fasting, exercise, meditation, ritual movement, these different ritual practices associated with these different, times of the year. But let's expand this a little bit. Okay, so let's look at this sacred symbol. It's one of the what we call Okra Komuadie. Okra means soul in the Akan language. Konmu means, Komuade means that sacred soul disc that they wear around the neck, similar to this. But it's for the washing or cleansing of the Okra, the soul or the divine consciousness of the sovereign. So just like you would cleanse your spiritual head on sacred days, the days sacred to your Okra, your soul, the divinity that governs your head, for the king or queen mother, they have Okrafo Ware, the people who wash the soul or engage the ritual process of cleansing the spiritual head and so forth. And they wear these Okrafo Komwade, these soul, they'll call them the soul washers discs, but they have this sacred symbolism. You have the fourfold division, which deals with the Okra, similar to this. This is another disc. These are just different variations of the same thing. But the fourfold division represents the Okra, the soul, the divine consciousness, the divinity that governs the head. So everybody is born into the world. Every Black person is born into the world with the divinity that governs our head, a male divinity if you're male, a female divinity if you're female, and so forth. In our Akan culture, for example, we are sent into the world on the day that is governed by that specific divinity. So when you're born on a specific day, when you hear somebody named like myself, Kwesi, or somebody Kwabena, or Abena, or Ami, or Kojo, or Kofi, or Afua, Abena, Ya, Yao, Abba, and so forth, Kweku, Akua, Ajua, Akwesiba, Akosulia, and so forth. Based on the divinity that governs your head, you're sent into the world on the day governed by that divinity. And they govern the solar, lunar, or planetary body that governs the day. So if you're born on Sunday, you're a child of Awusi. He's the major divinity animating the sun on that day on the male side. So you're a Kwa Asi or Kwasi, a servant Kwa of the divinity Asi or Awusi. So that's Kwasi and so forth, Kwesi. If you're born on Benada or Tuesday, a woman born on Benada is a child of the female divinity Abena, so she'll have the name Abena and so forth. So that's an indication to the community of what divinity was assigned to you pre-incarnation. That spirit makes sure that you're born on their day. And because you're born on their day, your first soul name or Kradin is one of those sacred soul names. And then you have other names as well. So the cross structure represents the soul divine consciousness. But then the diagonal cross structure, that is what in Akan is called the Sun Sun, the spirit or spirit body. It's the same chart, but dealing specific with the subject matter for today. On the right, you see the symbol of the Sun Sun. All the way to the right, it's the diagonal kind of structure that represents the spirit body. And then the cross structure represents the soul. So the soul and the spirit together, the symbols for that are included, for example, in this particular disc. Some discs just show the cross structure. Some of them show a combination of the cross structure, the Okra symbol, Okra, as well as the Sun Sun, the spirit body symbol. But when you have the union of the two, you have the four major points, as you see here. But then you also have the points in between. So you have all 8. There's an Adinkra symbol that incorporates all 8 points. And that Adinkra symbol is called Ohini Eniwa. Now, Ohini means king. And Eniwa means eyes. So Ohini Eniwa means the eyes of the king. Now, there's also a proverb that says Ohini Ye Oria. the king, Ohene, Ye, is Oria, the sun. So the king is associated with the sun, just like the queen mother is associated with the moon and so forth. But in this particular context, Ohene Ye Oria, the king is the sun. Ohene Eniwa, the king's eyes. And the proverbial wisdom associated with that symbol here is the king's eyes see all around the nation. So when you have a king that's grounded and circumspect and so forth, they see everything that's sitting in the midst of the nation. They see everything that's taking place. When you go back to ancient Khanid and Kemet, the right eye of Ra, the creator, is the sun. So that is the eye of the sovereign and so forth. When you see the solar disk here, the golden disk deals with the energy of the Oriya, the sun. It's incorruptible, powerful, vitality, and so forth. So when you see this disk, it has the Ohene Eniwa symbol, the eyes of the Ohene, the Eniwa, the eyes of the Ohene, the king. But the king, Ohene Ye Oriya, the king is the sun. The sun, the right eye of Ra. The moon is the left eye of Ra, but the sun is the right eye of Ra, and so forth. So encoded within this symbol, the eyes of the king see all around the nation. You have 8 quote unquote eyes. The fourfold division, the cross structure, which is the Okra, and then the diagonal cross, which is the Sun Sun, incorporated in that symbol. So you have all 8 points, all 8 positions of the sun, the 4 major points and the midpoints. The 4 major points and 40 days after each major point is a midpoint. We've always had that. When you see this structure here, it's called the solar parhelion. It's a circular rainbow. And if you see the full picture, you'll see it appears that a miniature sun is at each one of the 4 points and so forth. Now, when our people first were forced into North America during the enslavement era, we've always had this sacred symbol, the 4 positions of the sun and so forth. We structure our lives around that, sprouting. Or in fact, you have, when the sun sets, that's akin to a seed being planted in the ground. That's conception. Then the roots, you have germination, and then rooting, going deep down in the soil. That's the black sun hidden. Then when the sun rises and breaks through the surface of the earth and so forth, that's like the sprouting, breaking through the surface of the earth, the first sprouting of the plants. Then we get to the hot sun, that's the full flowering of the plant. And then when the fruits and stuff fall off the plants and you capture them, and this is the harvest time, the fall and so forth. So the same cycle of plant life goes along with this solar cycle as well. So we've always had that. We live our lives according to that. Our sacred ritual and behavioral cycles go in accordance with the movement of the sun and so forth, the movement of animals, plant life, the effectiveness of mineral life with regard to sacred medicine and so forth, go along with these cycles, and we govern ourselves accordingly. We even structure our villages in accordance with these sacred cycles, and you have certain buildings according to certain energy complexes in the sacred arrangement. We've always had that. So then we're forced into North America. We typically wear solar disk and wearing them on the chest, or having them on sacred clothing and shrine buildings for divinities and ancestral spirits and so forth. But then we're forced over here. We don't have access to gold. We're not fashioning these symbols and so forth. We'll draw them in the earth for a sacred Adinkra symbol, so-called sigil and so forth, that the whites and offspring will call it. But these sacred symbols are matrices of energy that we draw and pull a divinity within through ritual invocation and so forth, as well as an ancestral spirit. So we'll draw them in the sand, draw them in the soil, engage in ritual practice and so forth, draw them on our clothing or in a tree and so forth, whatever we're engaged in. But we also will look up and see the solar parhelion. That's a sacred rainbow kind of structure. And it reminded us of our sacred symbol. We could look up in the sky and still see our sacred symbol. This is where our sacred symbolism comes from. So, but we governed ourselves accordingly. So what you'll find is that Afro-Akani people, African Black people, even some consciously and some in later years, decades, unconsciously continued to follow this sacred cycle. They had a natural inclination to establish cultural and ritual practices around these sacred times. Some who were engaged in the Hoodoo tradition, as well as Juju and Voodoo and Wanga and Ngengan and Gullah and Geechee and so forth, if they still practiced the tradition, then they were establishing these ritual practices just in general. But those who were unaware, instinctively their Nsamanfo, their ancestresses and ancestors, the Abosom, the divinities that govern them, and their own Krawa, the divinity that governs their head, will lead them to establish certain practices that ended up falling within the same sacred cycle. So, for example, of course, you have spring equinox. For us, that's the time of Apo. In the Akan tradition, it's a time for purification. So let me take you to our website. Okay, so this is one of the pages on our website. So in the month of March, inclusive of the spring equinox, we have Apo Afashe, and we established that here in North America. There are Akan people on the continent, talking about in the Techiman and Wenchi areas, who still practice the Apo observance, those who still practice ancestral religion and so forth. And more people are returning back to their ancestral religion and rejecting the fake religions and so forth. But Apo means to reject. It's a time of purging any negativity, negative, spiritual debris and so forth. It's a time of purification. That's what Apo means. So there are ritual practices that are engaged in to, purify the individual, the family, the clan, the community. A 13-day observance. Now, we've been engaged in that process for thousands of years. During March, inclusive of the equinox. Of course, during the spring equinox, that's the time for ritual purification. We continued that process. You hear about spring cleaning in March. You hear about cleanup week in March and so forth. Purifying yourself in March. In the Hoodoo tradition, you would have people who would, have their children take cod liver oil or some other purgative and so forth, purify themselves, all these different things. That is the reason for that. So you see, instinctively, we continue to engage in the same process. We established a ritual observance that is, connected to what we've done for thousands of years. So we just changed the name, spring cleaning, cleanup week, things like that. But it's really the ancient Apo festival, and that goes beyond the Akan tradition as well. That goes back to ancient Khanit and Kemet. The next midpoint is May 1st. In European ritual calendars, they will say that's the celebration of the Maypole. And apologies, I have a little congestion from my voice, so it sounds a little bit different, but the celebration of the Maypole, May Day, that's in their calendar. For us, that's the sacred midpoint. So in North America, we still honored that. The original Memorial Day was established by Black people who are veterans of the Civil War. It was an ancestral observance. It was called Decoration Day. They were decorating the graves of their fallen, heroes and heroines and so forth. So what we did, and this is a picture from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And you see there the children, saluting, but it's a sacred observance. It's an ancestral communication ritual. You see it says on May 1st, 1865, a parade to honor the Union War dead took place here. This is in Charleston, South Carolina. The event marked the earliest celebration of what became known as Memorial Day. The crowd numbered in the thousands, with African-American school children from newly formed freedmen schools leading the parade. They were followed by church leaders, freed people, unionists, and members of the 54th, Massachusetts, 34th, and 104th U.S. Colored Infantries. The dead were later reinterred in Beaufort, South Carolina, which is not far from Charleston. So the key point is it's an ancestral ritual. It's not just, Europeans would see it as, oh, they're burying the dead. And we did. But we also pour libation. We engage in ritual drumming, ritual chant, ritual song to evoke the spirits of our Nsamanfo, our ancestors and ancestors, to communicate with them. Spirit possession would take place. Adebisa divination would be engaged in and so forth. It's an ancestral ritual day. So Memorial Day, originally May 1st, the same as the sacred Maypole ritual practice. They pushed it to May 31st. That happened in the law in America and so forth. But the original practice is on the midpoint. So you have June 21st is the summer solstice. Again, we have a natural inclination to engage in some kind of ritual practice that has something to do with our ancestral culture, trustery, ancestry, and so forth. So sacred ritual practice, they call it Juneteenth. Of course, that started in Texas. It was talking about people finding out about, being liberated from enslavement later than they should have and so forth. But Juneteenth is really the day before the summer solstice. So we establish a ritual practice of honoring our Nsamanfo, our ancestresses and ancestors, in the period right around the summer solstice. So for real, the Juneteenth, festival is a summer solstice sacred ancestral festival. In other words, we kept engaging in the same kind of ritual practices we've been engaging in for, thousands of years. This is an image of a couple of the women in the horse-drawn carriages, and they back in the late 1800s and so forth. The carnations on the wheels was, typical of some of the decoration that they would use. These are some of the soldiers who fought for our liberation and so forth. So what happened with regard to the Civil War, prior to that, there were the Gullah Wars. Misnomered the Seminole Wars, but they were really the Gullah Wars. It was primarily Afro-Akani people, African Black people, fighting for our liberation. They bankrupted the government of the United States because they put so many resources against fighting the Gullah, misnomered the Seminole, and so forth. It took them years to fight. There were 3 different, quote unquote, Seminole Wars or Gullah Wars and so forth. But that, major enterprise forced the Civil War to come into being. And then many of our people, oh, hold on one second. Somebody said it's not showing up. Yeah, for some reason there's a lag going on because normally when I use StreamYard, it just pops right in and out. So I'm not sure what's happening with them. Okay, but when you read about the Seminole Wars, or really the Gullah Wars, the Gullah and Geechee people were the main, actors in that, waging war against the whites and their offspring, forcing the United States military to eventually engage in the Civil War, and then we joined that war effort and forced the end of enslavement. So that's what Juneteenth is commemorating, but it's also an ancestral communication observance. So then the next midpoint is the Day of the Dead. That's what Europeans would call that, August 2nd. That's a midpoint. And what we have and what our people established once again is you have Black August. And we have a couple of images here. Okunfo Yao, which means warrior Yao, so-called Nat Turner. Warrior Yao Nat Turner, he was born on a Yao Thursday. He was Akan, so his name, his soul name, Pradine, would have been Yao, which is the divinity. Yao in Akan culture, the same as Heru, Yao in ancient Kemet. Yao is a title of Heru in ancient Kemet, warrior, divinity, and so forth. In Akan, the divinity's name is Yao, also Osoro. He is Shango in the Yoruba tradition, Hevioso in Vodun, and so forth. But so we refer to him as Okunfo, or warrior Yao, Nat Turner. His major insurrection and war happened in August. We also have Ogufo, which means metal caster, blacksmith. Geb. Geb is a divinity in ancient Kemet, but that's also Gabriel Prosser and so forth. He was a blacksmith, but he led that insurrection in Virginia in August as well. So there are a number of different things that took place in August. So when Black August was established by our people, and incorporate and reflect upon and incorporate the lessons of the resilience of our Nanano Nsamafo, our spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors. It's a month-long observance, and it begins at one of those midpoints, the August 1st, August 2nd midpoint, a sacred point in the cycle, and therefore we have a sacred ritual observance at that time. The next sacred point is September 22nd, 23rd. That is the fall or autumn equinox. In Akan culture, here in North America, that is our New Year observance. We have a 6-day observance, September 16th through the 22nd, or September 17th through the 23rd, depending on when the first day of fall is. And the final day of our 7-day observance is the New Year's Day. In Akan culture on the continent, their celebration floats between August, September, and October, depending on the year and so forth. But it's a 7-day New Year observance. It's the harvest time, and it's called Ojira, which means purification. It's the yam festival, the harvesting of the yam and so forth. So it's the end of one cycle, the end of the warm cycle, the beginning of the cool cycle, the end of the, harvest cycle, growing cycle, which means you harvest, but it's also the time to plant seeds to start that process over again. So the end of one cycle and the beginning of the next. So they say the ends of the year have met. And that takes place around that time. On the continent, it can flow between August, September, October. Here in North America, when we reestablished the Ojira observance, the New Year observance, it continues to be a 7-day observance, just as it is on the continent. But ours is calibrated towards to the fall equinox, so it always falls in September. And there's a reason for that. If you look, for example, in Ghana, it can move back and forth between August, September, October. In Ghana, the average temperature throughout the course of the year. It only fluctuates between like 70 degrees and 90 degrees as far as the average temperature. During the coldest time of the year, it's around 70 degrees and so forth. The hottest time of the year, in between, it's around 80 degrees. That's like the average temp. Of course, when we got here, even though, and they still recognize the entire yearly cycle and so forth, and there's a difference in the energy and so forth. But when we were forced over here, there was a stark difference between summer and winter and fall and spring and so forth. If we were forced into North America during the summertime and sold on a plantation and, it's 100 degrees outside, we're accustomed to that. But then something happened that never happened before. We started seeing, we wouldn't know that this happened to be what is called the fall in North America. But all of a sudden, we would see that the leaves started changing colors on all of the trees. And as we got into September, we also noticed something else, that all of the leaves started falling off of all of the trees. And after a number of weeks, all the trees were barren. We had never experienced anything like that before. We're wondering what kind of land we're in where all of the leaves fell off every tree that we can see as far as the eye can see. The grass starts changing color. And then a few months later, something else happened that we had never seen before. A bunch of white stuff starts falling from the sky and starts blanketing the entire area. And we wake up in the morning and we see nothing but white, nothing green. All the trees look dead. All the green colors of the leaves and so forth are gone. All the flowers have died and so forth. It looks like we've moved into a region of death where it's all white. We're experiencing something we've never experienced before, which is cold weather. The white-skinned individuals are in control of some white area where everything is dead and so forth. So we had to adjust to this new reality. The animals, some of them, migrated away. There are other animals we've never seen before and so forth. So we had to adjust to this new reality. Then we started realizing that after a number of months, all of a sudden the trees started coming back, plants started coming back, the buds started popping up and so forth, sprouts started coming, flowers started blooming again and so forth. Now we're in the spring, and then it started getting hot again. So we started realizing we were living in a cycle, but it's a very extreme cycle. It's much more extreme than what we experienced on the continent. So there's a stark difference, and there's a big shift in energy between September 22nd and December 22nd. So, but we calibrate our 7-day New Year observance here in North America to the autumn equinox, 40 days after that. So this is the Hoodoo New Year, it's the Akan New Year, but Hoodoo is Akan Ancestral Religion in North America. So it's all New Year. Now, and you'll also have this notion of around this time of the year, right before school starts, there's a purification. People are getting their children ready for school in September and so forth, and they're, getting them prepared and changing their schedule and purifying them and so forth. We will do that with our kids around this time, and it's about, winter is going to be approaching. You're changing the diet, you're changing the kind of clothes they're going to be wearing. You have purgative herbs and so forth that you give them. A number of different things that would happen, but that's part of a sacred ancestral observance. Now, so the next midpoint is what the whites and their offspring will call All Saints Day. The day before that is October 31st, which is quote unquote All Hallows Eve or Halloween and so forth. But then November 1st, All Saints Day, that's the midpoint, 40 days after September 22nd. Again, that's a 42-day cycle, the 42 deities who are assessors of Ma'at, the 42 days in the Akan Ancestral calendar and so forth. So it's a midpoint for us. It's a sacred midpoint amongst the Eve in North America. That is the Voodoo New Year. And let's look at that. So just like we have our Hoodoo New Year in September. You see the Voodoo New Year is November 1st, and there are sacred ritual observances associated with that. So you see we have this flyer here, Kalinda Laveau, Voodoo Queen Kalinda Laveau in New Orleans. She has the Voodoo Conjure Festival at this time of the year, every year, and so forth. And we've gone down there and participated, in that festival with her and assisted with that and so forth. So that's that sacred midpoint. And we have a ritual, ancestral ritual observance associated with that. The next point after November 1st is the next sacred quaternary cycle, which is the winter solstice. It's called Nain in ancient Kemet. That's the rooting period and so forth. And then we have what is the natural inclination for our people, especially those who are like, we're rejecting the fictionality of Christianity. Of course, Jesus is a fictional character who never existed of any race or any form. We know about the sacred triad of Asar, Aset, and Heru, and they stole the entire story of the death, resurrection of the individual who will come to restore order to the nation and so forth. They stole that from the cosmology of Heru and so forth. So this is where they took that portion of the cycle of that deity in creation and attached it to the fictional cartoon character Jesus or Yeshua. So those of us who reject and began to understand trustery, reject the fake religion, leave Christianity and so forth, most started embracing once again the sacred Nain festival, which is the winter solstice festival. That's what it's called in ancient Kemet. But then some who may not have learned about the specifics of that, yet they had a natural inclination to engage in ritual practice and communal celebration around this period, but they weren't interested in the whole Christmas nonsense. You'll find that another practice was established. And so you'll find, of course, that at that time in December, you have Kwanzaa. And we spell it with one A because that's initially the way they spelled it. And this is actually important. There's a certain point that you need to understand. This is one of the many elders. We learned about this about 30 years ago in the 90s. And this is one of the elders who was there back in the, 1971 and so forth, when a lot of these things were taking place. But so Maulana Karenga, previous to that, he was called Ron Karenga. When you do the research, and people have known about this, for decades who've done the research, he was a government informant. So a lot of people stopped celebrating Kwanzaa because they found out he's a government informant. He went to jail for torturing Black women. So he's an enemy to our people. He was an FBI informant. His organization went against the Black Panther Party. And even if, it was one thing to have differences between, different groups. Some were Black nationalists and, the Black Panther Party was into, socialism. So they weren't really grounded in our ancestral culture and tradition. But he was an informant. He was an enemy to our people. He ended up going to jail. The next thing you know, after getting out of jail, next thing you know, he's a professor at one of the universities in California. So people know about that, and they've exposed him for that. And a lot of people, stopped embracing Kwanzaa because of that. Hold on one second. Somebody's saying they can't see. Can you see it now? Do you see an image saying Apo? Okay. Do you see the page that said Kwanzaa now? So I'm just I'll read this portion. So yes. So we found out about this back in the 90s. And if you just Google, Maulana Karenga, FBI. You'll see all the details why he was torturing women and so forth, went to jail. And oh, let me see. You said you missed the one before. Okay, so that was the one for Voodoo Queen Galinda Laveau in New Orleans for the Voodoo New Year, November 1st, that midpoint. And then we also had the Hoodoo New Year, so that September 22nd, 23rd. And then that's the Voodoo New Year, November 1st. And here. So we want to bring this trustery out because it's important. And again, this is one of the elders who was there back in the early 70s and so forth. So listen to this. And he's on Facebook, as a matter of fact. Posts about this all the time. He says, as many of you may know, I've been teaching about Kwanzaa for many years. My goal has always been to give credit to those who have been ignored in the Kwanzaa narrative. Betty Shabazz considered the 7 principles as part of Malcolm X's legacy because she witnessed Josh Von Woolfolk, a delegate from the Cal State San Diego Black Student Council, present the 7 principles at the inaugural meeting of the Organization of Afro-American Unity, June 24th to 28th, 1964, in New York City's Audubon Ballroom. So, first and foremost, you'll always hear that Kwanzaa started in 1966. And Karenga will say he created the Nguzo Saba, or the 7 principles, in 1965. Betty Shabazz talks about how Josh Von Woolfolk presented the 7 principles in 1964 when Malcolm X was still alive at the first meeting of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. When he went to Ethiopia and he saw the Organization of African Unity, he wanted to come back and he created the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He was murdered in 1965, but a year before that, when they had the first meeting of the OAAU, the brother presented the 7 principles there before Karenga knew anything about them. So he's lying about starting Kwanzaa. He's lying about creating the 7 principles and when he created them. Now, very important. Arthur Joseph Graham, founder of the Black Student Council in 1963, was inspired by a letter of invitation that Malcolm X wrote in late May or early June, inviting recipients of the letter to come to New York for the formation of a new umbrella Black nationalist organization modeled after the Organization of African Unity. Malcolm had seen the OAU when he visited the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, and saw this, at that time, May 1964, less than a year-old Pan-African organization. Thus, we can surmise that Malcolm was inspired to form a similar organization to unite Blacks in the diaspora. Malcolm's vision inspired Arthur Joseph Graham to write the 7 principles. Now, Arthur Joseph Graham wrote the 7 principles. The widow of Marcus Garvey presented them with the aims and objectives and so forth, and he was looking at that, and he extracted from that. And he laid out unity and self-determination and collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and faith. He extracted that from what Marcus Garvey's widow gave him back in the 60s. He wanted, him and his other individuals with him wanted to start a holiday based on the 7 principles. They wanted it to last from December 26th to January 1st. This is in the 60s. They started learning about African culture and people becoming Black nationalists, and they started wearing afros and getting rid of the perms, and they were wearing dashikis and taking on African names and so forth. And part of that process, when they saw the Pan-Africanism, they were like, we need to all be able to speak at least one Afro-Akani language. That they were looking around the continent to see which language they should speak. And at that particular time, those who were Black nationalists and Pan-Africanists, they decided, well, why don't we all, at least the language that we learn in North America, we should learn Swahili because it's a major language on the eastern coast of Africa. It's also a trade language. So we should at least be bilingual in the context of we know at least one language. And some individuals were like, we don't know where we come from in Africa, so we need to pick a language that we all can use as a Pan-African language to communicate with each other. They looked around the continent and they decided they wanted to use Swahili. Nowadays, a lot of people are saying we should use the language of ancient Kemet, learn to read and write the Medut and Toro, the hieroglyphs and so forth. That's an ancient language and it can be unifying with regard to all people on the continent because all of the various languages on the continent can find their roots there. But back then, and they can still do it. Instead of saying Kiswahili, some people now say Kibantu and so forth, because even though Swahili has a lot of loan words from Arabic and so forth, at root it's a Bantu or Bantu language. So some people decide to say Kibantu instead of Kiswahili because Swahili comes from Sahel and it's not an ancient Afrikaans word and so forth. But in the 60s, people said, hey, we want to speak Swahili. That was their thing. So a lot of people started teaching Swahili. And a lot of people you'll notice in the 60s and 70s and 80s have Swahili names. So one of the people who were teaching a class in Swahili was Ron Karenga, who later became known as Maulana Karenga. So when Arthur Joseph Graham created the 7 principles by extracting them from Marcus Garvey's work after receiving it directly from Marcus Garvey's widow. And he said, hey, him and another brother, Joseph, okay, we need to start a 7-day holiday based on these 7 principles. These things can unify Black people and so forth. We can avoid this whole Christmas nonsense and have our people, do something. Now, he could have said, well, let's do it in the summertime. African people, Afrikaans people are people of the sun and so forth. Let's do it in the summer. But he was drawn to do it in the winter around Christmas time. The natural inclination is to do something around the winter solstice. He probably wasn't thinking that, but he was pushed to do that. So he said, we're going to 7 principles, 7 days. The 7 days are going to be December 26th to the 1st. But instead of using these 7 principles and only using English, we would at least like to use the Swahili names translations for these words. So if unity is the first principle, what's the Swahili word for unity? Of course, it's umoja, but if self-determination is, the second principle, we should at least use the Swahili word for that. So we can have Swahili words for each one. And then, the title. So they're like, who teaches Swahili? Oh, somebody named Ron Karenga teaches Swahili. So they brought these 7 principles to him. And they said, hey, we want to start a holiday. We're going to do 7 days based on these 7 principles that we have. Just translate these 7 words into Swahili. Leave the definitions alone. We just want you to translate the 7 words in Swahili. So they gave it to Karenga. He gave the translations. Unity is umoja, self-determination, kujichagulia. Just like people do that with me. They'll ask me, hey, how would you say this in the Tree Akan language? And I'll give them the answer. Karenga turned around and started telling people he created the Nguzo Saba and he created Kwanzaa. And then he ran with it and, people didn't check it at first. And the next thing you know, he's running around talking about he created a holiday. He stole the holiday. The whole holiday is based on 7 principles, and there are 7 days where people study those 7 principles and seek to incorporate them in their lives. The 7 principles were established by Arthur Joseph Graham, and all they did was ask Karenga to translate these 7 words into Swahili and to start this. Since he had an organization already, we want to start implementing this as a holiday. And then he started saying he created the holiday. So now that was on the first side. That's what that said on the first side. And this is just a summary. So the elder also says Karenga was expected to tell the complete story. Telling the complete story is more in depth than hearing a usurper Karenga created Kwanzaa. What he never bargained for example, was Sister Betty Shabazz pulled his card in 1968 when she was selected as co-Grand Marshal of the Watts Festival Parade. After flying her to Los Angeles to join Sister Merle Evers, the wife of Medgar Evers and so forth, in the honored role as co-Grand Marshal on August 10th, 1968, Sister Betty Shabazz got into an argument with Maulana Karenga, telling him, quote, "You are stepping on my late husband's legacy." She informed Karenga, saying, "We saw the 7 principles delivered by Josh von Woolfolk 4 years prior at the inaugural meeting of the Organization of Afro-American Unity in the Audubon Ballroom. Josh von Woolfolk was known for his dynamic presentations. She told Karenga that for her to ride in the Watts parade, he simply had to tell the truth. She did not ride in the parade." So she exposed Karenga. She confronted him. "Why are you claiming that you created the Nguzo Saba in 1965 and you created Kwanzaa? We already had these 7 principles in 1964, and they were presented by Josh von Woolfolk. And the reason they chose him, so Joseph Graham developed the 7 principles from Garvey's work. Him and Joseph Vincent, they formulated this idea for the holiday. But there was a brother named Josh von Woolfolk. He was known for being able to present and speak very well. So they said, you go to the Organization of Afro-American Unity and you present these principles because you're a good speaker. So that's what she was talking about. So he presented them in 1964. They were first established in 1963. Karenga claims he created them in 1965 after they gave them to him. And then he had the first holiday, observance in 1966. So, of course, and that's to be expected by somebody who's an FBI informant, enemy to our people, and so forth. So more and more people are finding this out. We found out the first elements of this back in the 90s. So we knew about this the whole time. That's why you hadn't seen us. You never see us talking about celebrating Kwanzaa and so forth. If you notice on our pages, you never see us talking about that because we knew what the issue was. Plus, we just didn't know all these details with these names and specific dates and so forth. The people who were there at the time and knew these people, he knew the person, Arthur Joseph Graham, who extracted the first principles. He knew him personally and so forth. So he knows the different players, and he talks about it all the time. But the key thing for us is there were Black people in North America who had an inclination to engage in some form of communal, ritual, ancestral process that revolved around the winter solstice. So for real, Kwanzaa is really a winter solstice festival that we continue to engage in. And then 40 days after the winter solstice, February 2nd, that they call Groundhog's Day, that's a mundane little observance, but originally it's a midpoint, a sacred midpoint. And of course, for us, that is what we would say, it'd be before Abakosem, which means Black people's Abakosem, or Trustorical or true story Black history. We have Nana Abena Araminta Harriet Tubman. She was in Abena, Tuesday born and so forth. Araminta is really Abra, or Abena Minta. It's an Akan name. Harriet Tubman knew that she was Akan. They even later did DNA test and showed that she is Akan. But she knew that, she even talked about it. Her grandmother came from the Akan regions. We have Nana Kwame Afrani, George Washington Carver, and so forth. So that's just representative of the kind of information we deal with on, Black History Month. But it starts off as a midpoint. February 2nd, February 1st is the midpoint, the sacred midpoint in our sacred cycle. So you look at all the, seasonal points and then the sacred midpoints, and every single point, Afro-Akani people, African Black people in North America have recreated some form of ancestral observance, whether they were doing it deliberately. Hold on one second. Said it didn't switch. Okay. Okay, so that's the Ebibifo means black people in the Akan language. Abakosem means history or true story. Bako means one. Asem means story. So one story meaning the true story as opposed to his story or history and so forth. So Ebibifo Abakosem is saying black people's story or black history and so forth, black true story. Now, so we showed, Nana Abana Afrani, George Washington Carver. We did broadcasts on Blog Talk Radio about them and their names and their, role in our true story and so forth. It's still on our YouTube page, so you can see that. But so as you can see, like every one of the seasonal points and every one of the midpoints 40 days after or 42 days afterwards, Black people in North America have established, hold on one second. So we have a, sacred midpoint as well as the cardinal points, so-called cardinal points, so the equinoxes and solstices and the sacred midpoints in between. So each one of the points around the Okra Komuadie, around the sacred circular soul disk and so forth, that includes the 4 points for the Okra, the soul, and the 4 points for the Sum, the spirit. You'll see them, a sacred ancestral observance that Black people in North America, because those who practice Hoodoo, as well as Juju and Voodoo and Wanga and so forth, we preserve those practices. But even the ones who didn't practice the tradition, they had a natural inclination to establish something that revolved around that. Now, some people, when they were formulating these days, they were practicing the tradition and they formulated it based on that. Other people who were practicing later, they didn't realize that these were Hoodoo, practices. So when we talk about Black History Month and the sacred midpoint, originally, Carter G. Woodson established Negro History Week and so forth in the 1920s. But then eventually, and he was from West Virginia. So in West Virginia in the 40s, they expanded Negro History Week to Negro History Month. And then eventually it's called Black History Month. But they started the entire month observance back in the 40s. When you read about Black History Month, they'll say it was acknowledged by the government in 1976, but we don't wait around, for the whites and offspring to acknowledge what we're engaged in. It was established back in the 1920s, and then it being a month observance is the 1940s, and it's been going on since then. So it's been, 80 years that we've been engaged in this Ebibifo Abakosem, or quote unquote Black History Month observance. Now, when you look at it, if you look at February, it's a full month. That's a midpoint. 6 months later is August 1st, and that is Black August. That's a full month. So that's studying the true history of our people, studying our resilience and our, waging war against the whites and offspring, forcing the end of enslavement and so forth, studying our accomplishments. So those midpoints, the February midpoint and the August midpoint, those are full month observances where we're studying and incorporating these aspects of our culture. The May 1st midpoint and the November 1st midpoint, which are 6 months apart as well, are ancestral ritual observances. May 1st is Memorial Day. It was originally Decoration Day. It was, decorating the graves of our people, but communicating with the Nsamafo, the deceased and so forth, our ancestresses and ancestors. And then November 1st is the Voodoo New Year, and that's also an ancestral observance as well. So the February midpoint is a month observance of studying the culture. That's February. The May 1st midpoint is an ancestral ritual observance. The August 1st midpoint is a full month observance studying, revolution, resolution, and so forth. And then the November 1st midpoint is a ancestral observance. With regard to the major seasonal points, you have March 13-day observance, or in North America, very often a 1 week, quote unquote, cleanup week, but it's ritual purification. 6 months later is September 16th through the 22nd or 17th through the 23rd, a 1 week observance where you have the New Year observance. The end of one cycle, beginning of the next cycle is the seeding time, conception time. It is our New Year. So, for example, in September we said 13,025, so-called 2025, but we say 13,000 of a 26,000 year cycle. We don't calculate time based on the fictional cartoon character Jesus, who never existed. So it's not 2025. Nothing happened 2,025 years ago. So we say 13,025, but that happened in September 23rd and so forth, or 22nd. 100 days before January 1st, which is the European New Year, that is the dead of winter, the dead of night, when everything is dark, cold, and dead, and then they yell Happy New Year. In the middle of the night, darkest time of the day, darkest time of the year, coldest time of the year, only cave dwellers from the ice will come out in the darkness of night in the coldest time of the year and yell out Happy New Year and celebrate. But we've never done that. So 100 days before their observance, the time of the harvest, but also the seeding time, the conception time, that's our New Year observance. So in March, at the equinox, 1 week observance for us is 13 days, but most people is 1 week. 6 months later, at the equinox, it's a 1 week observance, our New Year observance, the harvest time, and also conception time and so forth. And those are the equinoxes. And then you have the solstices in between. You have a day observance, Juneteenth. And then you have, the winter solstice observance, which eventually, some people, as again, they weren't thinking about the winter solstice per se when the original founders of Kwanzaa established it. They were probably thinking about taking, getting away from the whole Christian nonsense and commercialism nonsense, but not just commercialism in the context of wasting our money with our enemies, but also worshiping a fictional character that never existed. But they weren't focused on the cosmology of, the name celebration or winter solstice, but instinctively they were drawn to that time of the year. So that period, that's what it is. So that is what we wanted to share with everybody. Okay, can you all see that? All right. Okay, so this is the new book I just released, ODWIRASEM. Odwira means purification, Asem means issues or affairs, concerns, and so forth. So it's issues of purification, matters of purification. Trustorical anthology. So what it is 12 of the books that I published, 31 books, and 12 of them in one volume. And what we did was we expanded on the original publications. So those 12 books, pull up the back cover so you can see it. All right, so you should be able to see the back cover. These are the 12 books. Kuku Tuntun, the Ancestral Jurisdiction. And in that book, we show, for example, Jesus and Moses and Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Solomon, Sheba, Menelik, David, Muhammad, Allah, Yahweh, all fictional characters who never existed of any form, any race. We talk about the cosmological foundation of creation, the cosmology of our people and so forth, our true history, a number of different things. Ubin Sheng, the Ancestral Summons, talks about our ritual practices like ritual song, ritual dance, ritual chant, ritual prayer, ritual movement, libation, shrines, all these various ritual practices that have, utility in our culture. Afrakai, the origin of the term Africa. We go into the linguistics and cosmology, showing that A title of Ra, the creator, is Afura. The title of Ra'et, the creatress, is Afura'et. So when we talk about Afuraka, Afuraikai, the origin of the term Africa, we prove that in the language and culture of ancient Khanid and Kemet, as well as other languages on the continent. Ankh, the origin of the term yoga. Karakasa, the origin and nature of the chakra, showing that these terms come directly from ancient Khanid and Kemet and are fully incorporated in ritual thousands of years before India. We showed the Kokobo book earlier. These different articles showing that divine prohibition against dissexuality, homosexuality in ancient Kemet, because Europeans have started writing articles talking about that we were practicing that in ancient Kemet and so forth, which is, totally inaccurate. Anidaho, we talk about the origin of the term God, which is a title of Amen and Amenet. Ga, a title of Amen and Amenet in ancient Kemet. It's not a German term. It's not Proto-Germanic or Proto-Indo-European. We show the original terms in the Medutu, the hieroglyphs of ancient Kemet, and the cosmology around that sacred Ga, or Gaiat, the sacred goose, and Gander of ancient Kemet, sacred symbolism, animal totems of Amenet, the great mother, and Amen, the great father, and so forth. Rekit Hinasperet, the etymology and cosmology of religion and spirit. Those terms we can find in the Medutan Torah as well, in ancient Kemet. Sankofa Tahuti, talking about the deity Tahuti as he manifests in the Akan tradition, Yoruba tradition, Ewe tradition, and ancient Kemet, as well as Seshat, the female divinity of divine wisdom. Mor means dead, showing that term Mor means dead and the cosmology associated with that. The Okra complex, the nature of the soul as divine consciousness, the divinity in the head, and so forth, our divine function in the world. So we have a number of different texts. We've expanded upon them. So it's a 600-page book. It's in full color. We do have it on Amazon, but for our subscribers, we have it at a discount. Amazon takes, 60%, from booksellers in general. So that's why the prices have to be a little bit higher. But our book, the 600-page book in full colors, for subscribers, when you go to our website, the Odwirafo website, the Nhoma page, you can get the book. It's $55 plus shipping. But we also have the option of the Afterpay option. So when you click on Afterpay, and you can do the same thing when you order online, but it's more expensive online. But when you click Afterpay, when you're checking out, you can break up the payments into 4 installment payments that are interest-free. So it's like basically, what is it? I think it's $15. No, it's $13.75, for 4 payments. So if you go in, you can either pay the $55 up front, or you can click on Afterpay, and they'll break it into 4 payments of $13.75 each. And the amount you would owe today is $13.75, and then you schedule those other 3 payments out over time. So that way, your initial payment is just $13.75 possible. So this particular first volume, we're going to have more than one volume, but this first volume, this encompasses 20 years of publishing from 12,998, so-called 97, when we first released the Ubin Sheng on the Nain Festival on December 21st, the winter solstice, the Nain Festival, quote unquote 1997. For us, that's 12,998, but in the Gregorian calendar, 1997. And then we released the book Tuhuti, Sankofa Fa Ni Fa, the male divinity of divine wisdom and divination in Kemet, Akan, Yoruba, and Ewe. We published that book in 13,017. In fact, during the Obrajira observance, the New Year observance, during that 7-day observance. So this represents 20 years of publishing. This book encompasses 20 years of publishing, from Ubin Sheng to that Tahuti book and so forth. But we've also, expanded, and people who have read the books previously, when you look, for example, of what we put forward in Afuraka Afuraikai or Manenechi, Divine Law, Love, and Divine Hate, and so forth, or the Ankh book and so forth, you're going to see new information because we've traveled to Kemet and traveled to Ghana, since within that 20-year period. And we're able to gather more information as well as information about, more insight onto the things we'd already published. And we incorporated these things into the, the new editions. So you're going to see some new information you hadn't seen before if you had read the books previously. So we're going to go ahead and end it here. Yerase, we appreciate everybody for tuning in. Please support the new book as well as share it. And we look forward to shipping those out to you. And Yerase, we thank you. And Yabesha Bio, we will meet again. That's all. ODWIRASEM, Trustorical Anthology. This is a collection of 12 books in one volume written by Odwirafo, Kwesi Radnehmpata Akan. This 600-page anthology is comprised of 12 books within the 31-book corpus published by Odwirafo, which focus on trustery, cosmology, ritual, identity, and nation-building restoration for Afurakani, Afuraikaitnit people, African, Black people, wherever we exist in the world. Included within this anthology is the origin of the fictional characters Jesus, Allah, Yahweh, Buddha, and more. The etymology of the term God in the language of ancient Kemet, quote-unquote Egypt. Origin of the term Afuraka, Afuraikait, Africa in Kemet. Etymology and cosmology of religion and spirit in Kemet. Ankh and Kara, the origin of yoga and chakra in Kemet. Afurakani, Afuraikaitnit, African Black origin of civilization. Divine order in Afurakani, Afuraikaitnit, African cosmology. Ritual in Afurakani, Afuraikaitnit, African ancestral religion. Nature of the soul as divine function in Akan cosmology. More means dead. Male-female complementary balance in ancestral religion. Ancestresses, ancestors, goddesses, gods, biology, geology. Racial exclusivity in ancestral religion, spiritugenetic inheritance, and more. This anthology was curated to function as a volume that will positively transform the mind of any Afurakani, Afuraikaitnit, African, Black individual, youth, or adult who receives it. We examine every facet of Afurakani, Afuraikaitnit, African identity, empowering readers to transform their minds and thus transform their condition wherever they exist in the world. Special discount for our subscribers for the pre-order is only $55. See our website to order now. Yerase.